3 years ago, I did something quietly and without much ceremony that I genuinely believed at the time was a temporary experiment I would abandon within a few weeks. I removed Windows from my computer, installed Linux, and told myself I would give it a serious try for 30 days before making any permanent decisions. 3 years later, I have not reinstalled Windows. Not because I made some grand ideological commitment to open source software or because I developed strong opinions about Microsoft as a company. Simply because at the end of those first Teach Erty days, the reasons to go back were smaller than I had expected them to be. And at the end of the first year, those reasons had shrunk further, and somewhere in the course of the second year, I stopped thinking about going back at all because the question had lost its urgency entirely. I was using my computer. My computer was working. The relationship between me and my machine had settled into something that felt genuinely good in ways I had not anticipated, and that I find genuinely difficult to fully articulate to people who have not experienced the same transition. But I want to try, because 3 years is long enough to have perspective that 30 days cannot provide, and the ways that 3 years on Linux changed how I think about and use computers are more interesting and more transferable than a simple review of whether Linux works for everyday tasks. This video is not a beginner's guide to Linux. It is an honest account of what happens to your relationship with technology when you spend 3 years in an environment that is fundamentally different from what most of the computing world uses, and what that experience teaches you about the computing world you left. Let me start with the thing that changed first and most dramatically, because it happened faster than I expected, and its effects have been the most lasting of everything I'm going to describe. Within the first few months of using Linux full-time, I developed a relationship with my computer that I can only describe as more direct than anything I had experienced during 15 years of Windows use. By direct, I mean something specific. On Windows, the computer does things continuously that you did not ask it to do, for reasons that are not fully explained. At times, you did not choose, producing effects on your system that you may or may not notice. Updates install and settings change. Background processes consume resources for purposes the task manager labels with names that provide no useful information about what they are actually doing. Notifications appear from sources you never configured. The operating system has an ongoing agenda of its own that runs parallel to your own agenda as the person trying to use the machine and navigating the gap between those two. Agendas is a constant low-level cognitive overhead that you stop consciously registering after years of it because it becomes indistinguishable from the normal texture of using a computer. On Linux, that parallel agenda is largely absent. The operating system does what you tell it to do and waits when you're not telling it to do anything. Updates happen when you explicitly ask for them through the update manager. Background processes that run without your initiation are limited to genuinely system-necessary functions rather than telemetry, advertising infrastructure, and AI services. The resources your hardware possesses are available for your work rather than pre-allocated to the operating system's own operations. This sounds like a technical description, and it is, but its effect on the daily experience of using a computer is not merely technical. It feels different in a way that is hard to convey to someone who has not experienced the contrast. The machine feels like yours in a way that gradually becomes the baseline expectation, and returning to Windows after that baseline is established produces a specific and uncomfortable awareness of all the things the operating system is doing that you did not request and cannot fully control. The second thing that changed, and this one surprised me more than the first because I had not anticipated it at all, was how I think about software. On Windows, software installation is something that happens through a browser. You search for an application, you find the developer's website or a download portal, you download an installer, you run the installer, you click through several screens of options, including one that tries to install additional software you did not ask for, and you eventually have the application. This process is so normalized for Windows users that most people never question whether it is a reasonable way to manage software. On Linux, nearly every application you would want installs through a package manager, which is essentially a curated repository of software that your operating system knows about, can install with a single command or a single click in a graphical software center, keeps updated automatically when you update your system, and removes cleanly and completely when you decide you no longer want it. The difference in how this feels after you have used it for a while is significant. Software management on Linux feels organized, controlled, and trustworthy in a way that Windows software installation, with its downloaded executables from various websites of varying trustworthiness, simply does not. After 3 years, I find the Windows approach to software installation genuinely difficult to think about without a specific kind of low-level anxiety about what the installer is actually doing to the system during the installation process. The third change was in how I think about ownership of my computing environment. And this is the one that has had the most lasting effect on how I evaluate every piece of technology I use, rather than just my choice of operating system. Linux taught me through direct daily experience what it actually means to own and control your computing environment rather than to use one that belongs to someone else and is being made available to you under terms that can change. When I use Linux, the software on my machine does what I configured it to do. It does not change between sessions because a background update decided to alter a setting I had explicitly set. It does not add features I did not ask for. It does not remove features I depended on. It does not start collecting new categories of data about my usage because the policy document I never read was updated in ways that expand the scope of data collection. The configuration of my system is the configuration I chose, and it remains that configuration until I change it myself. This is ownership in a meaningful sense, and experiencing it consistently for 3 years has made me permanently more sensitive to its absence in other contexts. This sensitivity extends well beyond operating systems into every piece of technology I use. I now notice and think about data collection practices in applications that I would have accepted without thought 3 years ago. I notice when software changes behavior between updates in ways that serve the developer rather than the user. I notice when the default configuration of a tool is set to benefit the company that made it rather than the person using it. I notice when the path of least resistance through a setup process leads you toward giving away permissions and data that you have no specific reason to provide. None of this noticing was something I actively cultivated. It developed organically as a consequence of spending 3 years in an environment where these things were absent by default and therefore became visible through contrast when I encountered them elsewhere. The fourth change was in my relationship with hardware, and it is one I want to describe carefully because it has practical implications that go beyond abstract philosophy. 3 years ago, I was using a laptop that was 4 years old at the time of the switch, and that Windows 11 ran on with acceptable but not inspiring performance. On Linux, that same laptop ran with noticeably better performance from the first week, for the reasons I have described in other videos on this channel, primarily the significantly lower idle resource consumption of a Linux system compared to Windows. What that meant in practice was that a machine I had been mentally categorizing as aging and due for replacement performed well enough on Linux that I pushed my replacement timeline back by over 2 years. I'm now using a machine that is 7 years old and that runs my daily workload, which includes heavy browser use across many tabs, extensive writing in multiple applications, video calls, photo, editing, and occasional gaming without any performance complaints. The machine is 7 years old. On Windows, it would have been replaced years ago. On Linux, it remains genuinely adequate for everything I use it for. The financial implication of this is straightforward but worth stating explicitly. By extending the useful life of my hardware by at least 2 years, and likely more through the switch to Linux, I have avoided a hardware purchase that would have cost somewhere between $800 and $1,500 depending on what I would have bought. This is money I did not spend because Linux's lower resource overhead kept older hardware performing adequately for longer. When people discuss the economics of Linux versus Windows, the conversation usually focuses on the fact that Linux is free software, which is true, but which matters relatively little for most users since Windows comes pre-installed on purchased hardware. The more significant economic advantage of Linux is the hardware longevity effect, the ability to keep using machines that Windows would have made feel inadequate years before their hardware was actually exhausted. The fifth change is the most personal and the hardest to describe precisely, but I think it is also the most important for understanding why I'm not going back after 3 years. Using Linux changed my default assumption about technology from passive acceptance to active evaluation. Before Linux, my relationship with the software and service I used was fundamentally passive. I used what was available, I accepted the defaults, I adapted to whatever the software decided to do, rather than configuring the software to adapt to me. The primary reason for this passivity was not laziness or lack of interest, it was the absence of an alternative model. Windows presented itself as the complete and correct way for a computer to work, and in the absence of extensive experience with a different model, there was nothing to compare it against that would make the passive relationship feel like a choice, rather than simply the nature of things. Linux presented a different model, a model in which the user's preferences and configurations are the primary inputs shaping the computing environment, rather than secondary modifications, applied over a foundation of decisions already made by the software vendor. After 3 years of living in that model, passive acceptance of technology defaults no longer feels natural to me. I evaluate the default settings of every application I install. I think about what permissions I am granting and why. I consider whether the configuration of a tool serves me or serves the company that made it. I notice when defaults have been set in ways that are designed to benefit the developer rather than the user, and I change them. This is not a paranoid or adversarial relationship with technology. It is simply an informed one. The difference between an informed relationship with your tools and an uninformed one compounds meaningfully over time in ways that affect both your privacy and the quality of your daily computing experience. The specific things I miss about Windows after 3 years are worth naming honestly because the honest picture requires acknowledging them. Adobe Creative Cloud software is the most significant gap for a specific category of creative work, where I occasionally want capabilities that the Linux alternatives do not fully match. The situation has improved with compatibility layers, but it has not been completely solved. Certain games in my Steam library that use kernel-level anti-cheat systems remain unavailable on Linux and are likely to stay that way. These are real limitations, and I have adapted to them either through alternative tools or through accepting that some things I could do on Windows are not part of my Linux workflow. Neither adaptation has significantly degraded my computing life, but pretending the gaps do not exist would be dishonest. What I do not miss is everything else. I do not miss the advertisements in my operating system interface. I do not miss the automatic updates that change my configured settings without asking. I do not miss the background telemetry and data collection. I do not miss the performance overhead of an operating system running its own agenda alongside mine. I do not miss the anxiety of not knowing what the next update would change or break. I do not miss the feeling that the software on my machine was working for someone other than me as its primary stakeholder. 3 years on Linux changed how I use computers forever, not because Linux is perfect, but because it demonstrated through consistent daily experience that a different and genuinely better relationship between a user and their computing environment is possible. Once you have experienced that relationship clearly and for long enough to trust it, the alternative starts to look like something you should never have accepted as normal. Subscribe for ongoing coverage of what this computing life looks like in practice, what the tools are, how the workflows function, and where the genuine limitations still live for anyone considering whether 3 years on Linux might change how they use computers too.